What's up guys, Flick here. Welcome to the first cooking video on the channel, and I'm thrilled to start branching out into this style of content. I think that sports and cooking share a lot of similarities. For example, both are heavily influenced by their culture and both can be molded by trending events. Moreover, match day meal prepping is definitely a thing, so that may be a concept for me to consider in future videos. Having just finished a career mode with VfB Stuttgart, I thought what better way to introduce this series than to make a recipe from the Swabia region of Germany where Stuttgart is located. The dish that I'm making today is called Maultaschen, basically ravioli that is traditionally filled with meat and vegetables and often served in some form of broth. There are several stories that describe the origins of Maultaschen, but the one that I've come to know has to do with a few rebellious monks in the 17th century. Since long before that time, members of the Catholic Swabian were not allowed to eat meat on Fridays and during times of fasting. However, this particular group of monks was set on consuming meat, so what they did was mix the meat with various herbs and vegetables in order to create a visual illusion. To further enhance their deception, they placed the mixture in pockets of dough, and thus Maultaschen was born. The ingredients for this recipe will be split up into 3 separate categories, and the first of those categories is the filling. What you'll need is 175 grams of both ground beef and ground pork, the filling of 1 bratwurst, 60 grams of cooked bacon, 6 cups of fresh spinach, 3 tablespoons of fresh parsley, 2 eggs, 1 onion, 3 tablespoons of breadcrumbs, and then nutmeg, white pepper, and salt and pepper. For those last 3 ingredients, I would just do a pinch, but you can do the salt and pepper to taste. Moving on to the dough, this is the recipe that I use for basically any pasta, and it's pretty simple. You need 1 pound of all-purpose flour, 4 eggs, and 1 egg yolk, 1/4 cup of olive oil, 2 to 3 tablespoons of water, and 1 pinch of kosher salt. Finally, we have a few miscellaneous ingredients, and those are 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 1 liter of beef broth, and finally some sort of garnish. For the purpose of this video, I use chives. I think it's about time that we start cooking, and we'll begin by making our dough. In a large mixing bowl, I have my dry dough ingredients, that being the flour and kosher salt, and then what we've done is made a small well inside of our dry ingredients. This is where you're going to place your wet ingredients. So for each of your 3 wet ingredients, just place it directly into the well. Try to keep it within that small hole, but if a little bit goes outside, it's not too big of a deal. Starting with the eggs and then in with the olive oil, and finally we will place our water in there. Once you do have all your dry and wet ingredients inside the mixing bowl, you can go ahead and get started. If you don't happen to have one of these kitchen machines, I'm sure you could do it by hand, but for the purpose of this video, I did use the mixing machine because it's quite a bit easier. And after a while, it's going to start thickening up. You're going to want to keep doing this until all that flour has been blended with the dough. After you've mixed your dough, it's time to start kneading it. In order to do so, you'll need a large cutting board and some flour to keep the dough from sticking to said cutting board. Just place your dough right onto the cutting board and then just press down with the bottom of your hands. I guess your palm would be a good way to describe that. And then rotate and keep on doing that for about a minute or so. This is just going to make sure that your dough is well mixed together. It's going to make sure that all the flour has been integrated within the dough. And then once you're done, you'll want to cut that dough mixture in half, place it into a large bowl, and then let both of those halves rest for about 30 minutes. While your dough is resting, you can start preparing your filling. The first step that I like to follow is cooking down my spinach. I know that 6 cups of fresh spinach sounds like a lot, but it's really going to end up with not too much spinach once it's cooked down, so you'll need a lot to get just a little bit in return. I like to put a little bit of water onto my pan to keep it from sticking to the pan, and you'll just start by mixing that around, and then once it finally has cooked down to what you see right here, just place it onto a cutting board and then do a rough chop. It doesn't need to be too precise. It's gonna go into the filling after all, but you don't want large chunks of spinach within your ravioli or Maultaschen, so you want to keep it pretty small and just do a couple of rough chops there. After you've chopped your spinach, you can start preparing your onions. So we have a pan here over medium-high heat, and then you'll do a ring around the pan with some olive oil. I would say that's about 2 tablespoons worth of olive oil, but you can really eyeball it. It doesn't need to be too precise. After which you'll add your freshly chopped onions. These can again be a pretty rough chop, but you want to keep the size of those pieces around the same. but again, they're going to cook down, so it doesn't matter too much. While those are cooking, I would recommend that you season your meat. So we have a combination of ground beef, ground pork, and the filling of 1 bratwurst. There you can see I'm adding a couple of shakes of sea salt right into the mixture, and now we're going on to some white pepper. This is a pretty powerful ingredient, so you really just want to do a pinch, and you want to be careful when adding that to your mixture because it can ruin a dish if you add too much. The final ingredient that I added in was another pinch of nutmeg. You can also add some pepper to taste, but personally I found that the white pepper is enough to cover it. So I then went on to mash all that meat together. You want to really combine it and make sure that is as combined as possible. Once the meat has been mixed, you can add it directly to the pan with the onions, and as soon as you add it into the pan, you want to start breaking it down with some sort of utensil. I'm personally just using a spatula here, but you want this meat mixture to be in very, very small pieces because this is going inside the filling of a pasta. So you don't want large chunks of meat. I would say it takes about 4 to 5 minutes for the meat and onions to fully brown, but it'll depend on what sort of pan you're using and what sort of heat you have the pan on. Once it has finally browned, you can add the remainder of your ingredients for the filling, starting with the spinach that you've already cooked down, followed by some bacon that I've already prepared, and finally, you have some fresh parsley that you'll want to add. Because it's a fresh ingredient, you want to add it at the very end and only cook it for about a minute or so. It doesn't take very long for that parsley to cook, so add it just at the very end. The last step for your filling will be to take it off the heat and place it into a large bowl. We're gonna let this mixture cool down for about 30 minutes before we add it to our pasta. Otherwise, it's going to ruin the dough. So just let that sit on your countertop for about 30 minutes. This recipe requires a good amount of time management, so while we were cooking the filling, we were allowing our pasta dough to rest, and it has finally rested for 30 minutes or so. And of course, we have 2 halves of pasta dough, so you need to do this technique twice for each half. It's pretty simple. It's just a matter of using your rolling pin to roll out the pasta dough into a thin layer. One thing that you do need to watch out for is your pasta sticking to either the rolling pin or the cutting board. So in order to stop that from happening, you'll want to have some flour to the side, either placed directly onto the cutting board or onto the rolling pin. And after a while, your pasta dough will start to look like this. You can see it's a nice thin layer and even as well. A good sign to let you know that you're coming to an end of this process is if the pasta dough is starting to break. If you find that it's starting to break, then you'll probably want to stop. It's probably thin enough, and then you're just gonna want to even it out into a even strip. And obviously it's not gonna come out in a pretty shape, so what you'll wanna use is a pizza cutter or some sort of knife to turn that into a rectangular strip and repeat this process for your other half of dough. Returning to our mixture, we've let it cool down, and now we can add the remainder of our ingredients, starting with the 2 eggs. And that's the main reason we let it sit for a while, is because if we added the eggs when it was still warm, they would just turn into scrambled eggs, and that's not something we want for this recipe. But we also added 3 tablespoons of breadcrumbs. Then you're going to mix it all together, and that should allow the filling to be a little bit more moldable and flexible, which is just what you want. You're then going to transfer it onto your pasta sheet, and you can see there at the top I added a couple of indents to give you an idea of where you want to place the pasta. 5 columns by 3 rows, that should allow for 15 separate Maultaschen, and then I'm going to speed this process up a little bit for you guys. You don't want to be slacking with the filling. You definitely want to add a good amount on there, and you can always take some away if need be, because the first time I made this recipe I didn't add enough filling, so you pretty much want to portion out your fillings so that you use the entirety of what you made. I found this next step to be one of the more complex ones in the recipe, so you'll want to follow along closely, but you'll take 1/2 of your pasta sheet and place it directly on top of the other half, and you'll probably need to adjust it accordingly as I'm doing right here. Try to think of it as a sandwich where you can't even see the bottom pasta sheet because the top one is completely covering it. But once you're at a point where you're happy with, you're gonna wanna take your pizza cutter once again and find that little area of space between the 2 fillings and then make a cut directly down. This will allow for 4 separate cuts across and then 2 cuts across, ending up with 15 Maultaschen. Once you have individual Maultaschen, you can use a fork or your thumb and index finger to create a crease.
and you'll want to press down pretty hard because you don't want any of that filling or as little of the filling as possible to drip out when we do eventually cook the dough. So you're gonna want to do this on each of the sides. It should be a pretty quick process, but of course you do need to do this for each of the Maultaschen. So make sure you take your time on this because it can ruin the recipe if all the filling were to leak out, and make sure to also do it on both sides. When it comes to cooking the Maultaschen, you'll want to have 1 liter of beef broth over a low to medium heat. Right now, I'm just making the beef broth using 1 liter of water and 3 bouillon cubes, mixing that together until they're fully incorporated. And then you'll want to slowly add the Maultaschen into that mixture and cooking them for about 10 minutes.
The Maultaschen are just about finished, so I'm gonna plate them up for you, give you an idea of what it should look like. So you're just gonna take a utensil to scoop these out. I would say get 2 Maultaschen for each serving, so just right in there. And your second one. And then you'll just get a ladle, get some of the broth, which if you're gonna eat it in a soup, it's kind of necessary. So maybe 3 or 4 scoops. And then how I would end this is just putting a little bit of garnish on. So what we have is just a couple of chives, just sprinkled right over the top. Make it look nice and visually appealing. There you can see the Maultaschen, beautiful ravioli. I'm gonna go ahead and try some and just let you know how it tastes. So the pasta's well done. It's soft, you don't want it too al dente for a soup. We got a nice piece with some of the insides as well. And it's hot, but it's good. You can really taste all the different flavors. For what we used a mixture of ground beef and ground pork, and I feel like that comes through from the dish, and I would say almost the flavor intensifies as it simmers in the broth. But that's gonna be it for today's recipe. A couple hours in the making, but I think it was worth it. And I think it's definitely something you guys could replicate at home. It's not too difficult to make if you can prepare things ahead of time. And it's just an enjoyable experience. But I plan on doing more of these cooking videos, and I need your input on what recipe I should be making next. So what I want you guys to do in the comment section down below is for me to let me know what recipe I should make, where in the world it comes from, and also the story behind it. I want to know the story of why you enjoy and how it connects to your community, not just how it tastes. So if you can leave a comment down below with that information, that would be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you guys did enjoy this video, make sure you leave a like down below. And subscribe to the channel if you do happen to be new around here. But until next time, this has been Flick. I'll be talking to you guys again soon.